One casual invitation to watch a movie blurred the lines we'd carefully drawn, transforming an ordinary night into something unforgettable. Funny enough, it had all started with a burst pipe on a Saturday, a day that was supposed to be nothing more than light cleaning, a glass of wine, and a guilty pleasure reality show marathon. But, as they say, things rarely go as planned. That morning, I'd woken up to the sound of water rushing somewhere it shouldn't have been. Groggy and still half asleep, I stumbled into the kitchen to find a puddle spreading across the tiles, creeping toward my feet. I groaned, already dreading the mess I'd have to deal with. After a few futile minutes of trying to turn off the water myself, I gave up and called the first plumber that popped up on my phone. The plumbing company sent someone over right away. And within an hour, I heard the knock on my door. When I opened it, there stood Jack, the plumber they sent, a man who looked a few years older than me, maybe early 30s. With broad shoulders and a calm, capable look about him. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, but the way he carried himself made him seem effortlessly put together. Like someone who could handle anything thrown his way. "You're the one with the leak in the kitchen, right?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. "Yeah, that's me," I said, managing a laugh as I stepped aside to let him in, though honestly, leak might be putting it mildly. Jack took a quick glance at the mess in the kitchen, then nodded. "I've seen worse," he said, giving me a reassuring smile. "Let me take a look." He set his toolbox down and got to work right away, crouching under the sink and inspecting the pipes with focused precision. I watched him from a distance, unsure what to do with myself. As he worked, I tried to distract myself by cleaning up the water that had spilled across the floor. But my gaze kept drifting back to him. There was something oddly calming about his presence, the quiet way he moved and worked. Finally, he pulled himself out from under the sink, wiping his hands on a towel. "Looks like it's a pressure issue," he said. "A few old fittings need replacing, but nothing too major." "Thank you," I said, breathing a sigh of relief. "I thought I'd have to tear up my kitchen floor or something." He laughed softly. "Nothing quite that drastic. Just give me a few minutes, and I'll have everything sorted out." I leaned against the counter, watching as he opened his toolbox and started rummaging for parts. I couldn't help noticing the way his hands moved with practiced ease. The way his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked. He was clearly someone who took pride in what he did, and there was something strangely appealing about that. "Is plumbing always this exciting?" I asked, half joking, trying to break the silence that had settled over the room. Jack chuckled, glancing up at me with a small smile. "Depends on the day," he replied. "Some days it's just clogged drains and leaky faucets, but every once in a while, you get something interesting." I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting like what?" He grinned, leaning back against the counter for a moment, as if considering how much to share. "Let's just say I've seen some things I'd rather forget," he said, his eyes twinkling with a hint of humor. We both laughed, and the conversation drifted to lighter topics, the weather, the neighborhood, little things that filled the silence. The more we talked, the more I found myself drawn to him. There was an ease to him, a quiet confidence that made me feel comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. "Okay," he said finally, snapping his toolbox shut. "That should do it. Try running the water. Let's make sure everything's working right." I reached over to turn on the faucet, and sure enough, the water flowed smoothly without any ominous sounds or leaks. "Looks like you're a miracle worker," I said, only half joking. Jack chuckled, packing up his tools. "Just doing my job," he replied modestly, though I could tell he was pleased with the result. As he stood up, I caught myself wishing I could find an excuse to keep him here a little longer. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so at ease with someone, let alone someone I'd only just met. And then, almost as if he'd read my mind, he paused, glancing at me with a curious expression. "You're good with everything here?" he asked, his tone casual but with a slight hesitation. I hesitated, feeling a strange sense of reluctance to let him go. "Yeah, I think so," I said slowly, but the words didn't feel quite right. I wanted to say something else. Something that would keep him here even if just for a little while longer. Jack nodded, adjusting his toolbox as he took a step toward the door. But then he stopped again, looking back at me with an unreadable expression. "If you ever need help with anything else around here," he said, his voice a little softer, "don't hesitate to call." "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind," I replied, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite explain. We stood there in silence for a moment, neither of us quite sure what to say next. There was something in his eyes, a warmth, a quiet understanding that made me feel like he could see right through me. It was strange, unsettling in a way, but also comforting. Just as he turned to leave, I blurted out, "Actually, would you like a coffee? I mean, you've been working non-stop, you must be thirsty." He looked at me, surprised but clearly considering it. After a brief pause, he smiled. "Yeah, sure. Coffee sounds good." I felt a rush of relief as he followed me back into the kitchen, where I started the coffee machine. As the rich aroma of coffee filled the room, I felt the tension ease a little. The atmosphere shifting into something warmer, more familiar. We sat down at the small kitchen table, our mugs steaming between us, and talked about everything and nothing. He told me a little about his job, the challenges of running a small business, and the quirks of working with people in their homes. I found myself sharing more about my own life than I usually did with strangers, opening up in ways that felt surprisingly easy. There was something about him, something steady, grounded, that made me feel like I didn't have to hold back. "So," I said after a while, smiling as I lifted my mug, "is this the strangest coffee break you've ever had on the job?" Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Not by a long shot," he replied, grinning, "but definitely one of the nicest." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, and I looked away, suddenly feeling self-conscious. But when I glanced back up, I found him watching me, his gaze soft and thoughtful. There was a warmth in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat, and for a moment, I felt like we were the only two people in the world. We talked for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. But time seemed to lose meaning as we sat there, our laughter and conversation filling the space between us. It was the kind of connection that felt effortless, natural, as if we'd known each other much longer than we actually had. Eventually, though, the conversation lulled, and the quiet returned. Jack glanced at the clock on the wall, his expression a mix of regret and resolve. "I should probably get going," he said, though there was a hint of reluctance in his voice. I nodded, feeling a pang of disappointment I hadn't expected. "Yeah, of course. Thank you again for everything. You really saved me today." He smiled, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. "Anytime. Just give me a call if you need anything." As he headed toward the door, I followed him, unsure why I felt so reluctant to see him go. There was something unspoken between us, a subtle tension that made my heart race, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. At the door, he turned back one last time, giving me a small, almost hesitant smile. "Take care, Laura." "You too, Jack," I replied, feeling a strange sense of loss as I watched him walk down the hallway and out of sight. I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to make sense of the day's events. I hadn't expected any of this. A simple repair call had turned into something else entirely, something I couldn't quite explain. And as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, I found myself wondering if this was the last I'd see of Jack, or if somehow, this was just the beginning. It was strange how one day could make such a lasting impression. After Jack left, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at me, or the warmth of his smile that seemed so genuine. Or maybe it was just the sudden, jarring realization that, for the first time in a while, I'd felt truly connected to someone. A few days slipped by, but no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, thoughts of Jack lingered. I went through the motions of my daily life, pretending I hadn't been affected, but every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, wondering if he'd call or if I'd ever see him again. Then, one evening, just as I was settling in for a quiet night at home, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. My heart leapt when I saw his name on the screen, and I answered a little too quickly, trying not to sound as excited as I felt. "Hey, Laura." Jack's voice was warm and familiar. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Oh, not at all," I replied, probably a bit too eagerly. "It's good to hear from you." He chuckled softly. And I could picture him leaning back, relaxed, that easy smile playing on his face. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab a coffee sometime, outside of broken pipes and all that." "I'd like that," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though inside, I was buzzing with excitement. We settled on a small coffee shop downtown, a cozy spot he suggested, and as I hung up, I found myself grinning like a teenager with a crush. When we met at the coffee shop the next day, the awkwardness I'd feared never came. Jack greeted me with a warm smile. And from the moment we sat down, our conversation flowed effortlessly. I felt as though I'd known him forever. The simple, comfortable feeling between us was unlike anything I'd felt in a long time. We laughed, talked about our lives, our dreams, and somehow, as the hours passed, I felt my worries melt away, replaced by a strange, exhilarating feeling of freedom. As our coffee turned cold and the afternoon slipped into evening, neither of us seemed in any hurry to leave. Finally, Jack glanced around and suggested a walk along the river nearby. I agreed, feeling that strange thrill again as we stepped outside together, the cool evening air wrapping around us. We walked in silence for a while, the city lights reflecting off the water, illuminating our faces with a soft glow. He shared stories of his childhood, little moments that made me laugh, and I found myself opening up to him, sharing memories I hadn't thought about in years. After a while, we stopped to lean on the railing, looking out over the water, our shoulders brushing as we stood side by side. He glanced at me, his eyes warm and searching, and for a moment, I felt my heart skip a beat. I hadn't felt this way in years, a mixture of excitement, fear, and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Laura, I have to admit," he said, his voice soft, "I didn't expect this. Meeting you, I mean." I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his expression. "I didn't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad I did." He smiled, his gaze never leaving mine, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had faded away. We were standing so close that I could feel the warmth of his arm against mine, hear the soft sound of his breathing. A quiet tension hung between us, something unspoken but undeniable. And before I knew it, I found myself leaning in, caught up in the moment. But just as I felt his breath on my cheek, a sudden rush of footsteps broke the silence, jolting us both back to reality. We pulled apart, embarrassed, and I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off. Jack scratched the back of his neck, chuckling softly as he glanced down. "Maybe we should get going," he said, his voice laced with nervousness. "Yeah," I replied, still flustered, though a part of me wished we didn't have to end the night so soon. We walked back to my place, neither of us saying much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held a promise, something unspoken and thrilling. When we reached my building, he lingered at the door, giving me that same warm smile that seemed to melt my heart every time. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a pang of regret as I realized he'd have to leave. I had a great time. Jack hesitated, his gaze lingering on me, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else. But instead, he gave a slight nod, said good night, and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and a strange sense of anticipation that wouldn't go away. The days that followed were a blur of texts and phone calls, each one making me feel like I was walking on air. Our conversations grew longer, our connection deeper, and soon enough, it was as if we'd known each other forever. But beneath the excitement, a part of me felt nervous, unsure of where this was going or what it meant. Then, one evening, he asked if I'd like to come over to his place for dinner. It was such a simple invitation, but my heart raced as I read his message. I agreed, my mind racing with thoughts of what the night might hold. When I arrived at his apartment, he greeted me at the door. Dressed in a casual button-down shirt that brought out the warm tones of his skin. His place was cozy, with a lived-in feel that made me instantly comfortable. He'd gone all out for dinner, setting the table with candles and even a bottle of wine he claimed to have borrowed from his brother, a wine enthusiast. As we ate, our conversation flowed as easily as ever. But there was a new tension between us, a quiet anticipation that had been growing with each encounter. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands seemed to hold a deeper meaning. A promise of something more. And as the evening went on, that tension only seemed to intensify, making my heart race with each passing moment. After dinner, we moved to the couch. The wine glasses still in our hands, the room bathed in the soft glow of the candlelight. He told me stories about his family, his love for travel, his plans for the future, and I listened, captivated by his every word. But as the night wore on, the conversation began to slow, replaced by a charged silence that filled the space between us. The warmth of his hand resting just inches from mine, the steady rise and fall of his breath as he leaned back, his gaze fixed on me. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached over, letting my hand rest gently on top of his. He looked at me, surprised, and for a moment, neither of us moved. There was something in his eyes, something intense, unspoken, that made my heart race. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, but somehow, I knew he understood. Slowly, he leaned in, his eyes never leaving mine. And I felt my pulse quicken as our faces drew closer. My heart pounded, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them mattered in that moment. All I knew was that I didn't want to pull away. But just as our lips were about to touch, a loud knock echoed through the apartment, shattering the quiet. We pulled apart, startled. And I looked at him, my face flushed with embarrassment. Jack frowned, clearly annoyed, and stood up to answer the door. When he returned, his expression was tense. His jaw set in a way I hadn't seen before. "Sorry about that," he muttered, his voice tight. "Just a neighbor." I forced a smile, but the interruption had left me feeling unsettled. There was a tension in the air now, something unspoken and tense that hadn't been there before. I wasn't sure if it was the disappointment of the moment or something deeper. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. We sat in silence for a while, the earlier warmth replaced by a strange awkwardness. I wanted to say something to bridge the gap between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we simply sat there, side by side, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "Laura, I don't want to make things complicated," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "But there's something here, something I haven't felt in a long time." I looked at him, my heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. "I feel it too," I whispered, unsure of what else to say. He nodded, his gaze softening as he reached for my hand. "Then let's take it slow," he said, his voice barely audible. "Let's not rush this." I squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of relief wash over me. Maybe we didn't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to just be here together, figuring it out as we went along. As the night came to an end, I left his apartment with a whirlwind of emotions. Unsure of what the future held but strangely at peace. We'd taken the first step into something new, something uncertain, and though it terrified me, a part of me couldn't wait to see where it would lead. It had only been a few weeks, but things between Jack and me had moved forward in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Our time together was filled with laughter, easy conversation, and quiet moments that made me forget everything else. But there was also a tension between us. An unspoken pull that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One night, after one of our usual dinners, he invited me over to his place to watch a movie. It sounded casual enough. But as I sat next to him on the couch, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, I couldn't shake the nervous energy coursing through me. Every glance, every accidental brush of our arms seemed charged, filled with a promise I wasn't sure either of us was ready to voice. We watched the movie. Our attention split between the screen and the quiet tension building between us. After a while, I realized I'd been holding my breath, my heart pounding as I waited for, I wasn't even sure what. Then, during a quiet moment in the movie, he looked over at me, his eyes searching mine. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the screen, casting shadows that softened his features and made his expression unreadable. Slowly, as if testing the waters, he reached for my hand, his fingers warm and firm as they intertwined with mine. I felt my pulse quicken, the air between us thick with anticipation. "Laura," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I've been waiting a long time to meet someone like you." I looked at him, feeling a rush of emotion I couldn't quite put into words. He was so close that I could feel his breath against my skin, his gaze intense and unwavering. I didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to explain the feelings that had taken root inside me. So instead, I leaned in, closing the small distance between us. Our lips met softly at first, a tentative, lingering touch that sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the warmth of his hands as they moved to gently cradle my face, his thumbs brushing lightly over my cheeks. The kiss deepened. Slow and deliberate, each moment drawing us closer, erasing the boundaries that had held us back. As the kiss grew more intense, I felt his hands slide to my shoulders, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My fingers tangled in his hair, and I let myself get lost in the moment, in the feel of his lips moving against mine, in the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath my hand. It was a quiet, consuming kind of passion, gentle but intense, like we both knew that this moment was about more than just the kiss. It was about everything we hadn't said, everything we'd kept hidden until now. We pulled away just enough to catch our breath, our foreheads resting against each other. I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the same mix of excitement and uncertainty. That was what I felt. He brushed a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my skin, and I felt a thrill rush through me. A warmth that spread from where his hand rested on my cheek all the way to my toes. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," I replied. My voice barely audible but filled with all the certainty I felt in that moment. "More than okay." He smiled, and I could see the relief in his expression. The way his shoulders relaxed as if he'd been holding back, unsure of where this was all going. Slowly, he leaned in again, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was softer, slower, filled with a tenderness that took my breath away. The world around us seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us wrapped in each other's warmth. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer until I was pressed against him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he held me. My heart raced, every nerve alive with the thrill of being so close to him. Of finally crossing the line we'd both been dancing around for so long. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, and his response was immediate. His kisses grew more fervent. More insistent, and I felt myself sinking deeper, letting go of the last of my reservations. There was no turning back now, no stopping the surge of emotion that had built up between us. All that mattered was this moment, the feel of his hands on my skin, the warmth of his body against mine. Somehow, we ended up lying on the couch. His arms wrapped around me as we held each other close. The room was quiet, save for the sound of our breathing, the gentle hum of the city outside. I looked up at him. My fingers tracing the lines of his face, memorizing every detail, every little thing that made him who he was. He smiled down at me, his gaze filled with a softness that made my heart swell. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "Me too," I whispered, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. It was true. I'd spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own. But now, lying here with Jack, I realized just how wrong I'd been. I'd been waiting for something like this. For someone like him, without even knowing it. We lay there for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's warmth, our bodies entwined, our hearts beating as one. We melted into the moment. Lost in the depth of our connection, talking about everything and nothing. Our words flowed effortlessly. He shared stories from his past, little moments that shaped him. Dreams he'd once had but set aside. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone before, sharing pieces of myself I usually kept hidden, vulnerable yet safe in his presence. Our closeness was palpable, a living, breathing entity that enveloped us. Every shared secret, every whispered confidence drew us deeper into each other's souls. Time stood still. And the world outside receded, leaving only the gentle rhythm of our breathing, the warmth of our skin, and the unspoken understanding between us. It was strange how natural it felt. How easy it was to trust him, to let down my guard and just be myself. There was no pretense, no need to pretend or hold back. And as the night wore on, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. A feeling of belonging that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Eventually, the conversation lulled, and we fell into a comfortable silence, our fingers entwined as we lay there in the dim light. He pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, his hand running gently through my hair, and I closed my eyes, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. I didn't want it to end. Didn't want the night to slip away and leave us back in the real world, where everything was complicated and uncertain. But I knew that no matter what happened, this moment would stay with me forever, a memory of warmth, of connection, of finding something I hadn't even known I was searching for. As I drifted off in his arms, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my cheek, I realized that I'd never felt so content, so utterly at peace. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges or uncertainties lay ahead, I wanted to face them with him by my side. The following weeks with Jack felt like a whirlwind, a beautiful, chaotic blur of laughter, quiet evenings, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. I had never felt so at ease, so entirely myself, as I did with him. Every time we were together, the world seemed to fade away, leaving just us and the life we were slowly starting to build around each other. But as perfect as it all felt, there were also moments of uncertainty. Times when I'd catch myself wondering if this was too good to be true. There was always a quiet voice in the back of my mind reminding me of how fragile things could be, how easily life could change. And as much as I tried to ignore it, that voice only grew louder. One night, after a long day, Jack and I were sitting on my couch, lost in the comfortable silence that had come to define our time together. He had his arm around me, and I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. The steady beat of his heart beneath my hand. But beneath the quiet comfort, I sensed a heaviness, a weight that neither of us had addressed. "Jack," I murmured, breaking the silence. "Where do you see this going? With us, I mean." He looked down at me, a mix of surprise and contemplation in his gaze. I could see him weighing his words, choosing carefully what to say. "Laura," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I don't have all the answers. But I know that I want this. I want us." A wave of relief washed over me. But it was quickly followed by a lingering doubt, a question that had been gnawing at me for days. What if this doesn't work out? What if we're just setting ourselves up for heartbreak? He took a deep breath, his hand gently stroking my arm. "I don't know what the future holds," he admitted, his tone filled with a quiet honesty, "but I know that every moment with you feels worth the risk. I don't want to spend my life wondering, what if?" His words hung in the air, wrapping around me like a promise, filling me with a sense of certainty I hadn't felt in years. And as I looked at him, at the warmth in his eyes, the steadiness of his gaze, I felt the last of my fears begin to melt away. I didn't need all the answers. All I needed was the courage to take this leap with him, to trust in what we had. Even if the future was unknown. I leaned in, capturing his lips in a kiss that held everything I couldn't put into words, all the hope, the fear, the joy of finally finding someone who felt like home. He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me as if to say he'd hold on no matter what. And in that moment, I felt something shift, a quiet understanding settling between us. A silent vow to face whatever came our way together. The days that followed were a blend of small moments and quiet gestures, each one building on the last. Creating a foundation of trust and understanding. Jack showed up in ways I hadn't expected, not just in grand gestures or romantic surprises, but in the little things. The way he remembered the details I'd shared about my day, the way he knew exactly when I needed a quiet moment or a warm embrace. One evening, after dinner, as we were cleaning up together, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Have you ever thought about what it would be like to live together?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with something deeper. The question caught me off guard, and I paused, the dish towel still in my hand. I don't know," I stammered, feeling a rush of emotions I hadn't expected. "I mean, yes, I've thought about it. But..." He smiled, reaching for my hand, his gaze warm and reassuring. "No pressure," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know that it's something I'd like when you're ready." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of surprise and joy. And in that moment, I realized just how deeply he'd become a part of my life. The idea of sharing a home with him, of building a life together, filled me with a sense of hope I hadn't dared to feel before. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of a future with him, a future where we didn't have to say goodbye at the end of each night. Months passed, and our lives began to intertwine in ways I'd never imagined. We spent weekends exploring new places, discovering hidden corners of the city, making memories that became part of the tapestry of our relationship. We shared secrets, dreams, fears. And in the quiet moments, I felt a kind of peace I'd never known, a peace that came from knowing I was truly seen, truly accepted for who I was. One evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jack reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. He looked at me, his gaze steady, filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Laura," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never imagined I'd find someone like you, someone who makes me want to be better, who makes me feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." I felt a lump rise in my throat, a mix of joy and gratitude that I couldn't put into words. "Jack, I feel the same way," I managed, my voice trembling with emotion. "You've changed everything for me." We sat there, hand in hand, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, leaving a warm golden glow that wrapped around us. And as the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, I felt a sense of contentment settle over me, a quiet certainty that no matter what came next, we would face it together. As the night deepened, we stayed there, wrapped in each other's warmth, the world around us fading into the background. There was no need for words, no need to plan or define what came next. We had found something rare, something worth holding on to. And in that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we had everything we needed. Because sometimes life surprises you in the best ways. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find exactly what you've been searching for, even if you didn't know you were searching. And that's exactly how I felt, sitting there with Jack, a quiet, certain kind of happiness that made all the waiting, all the risks, feel like they'd been worth it. And as I looked at him, at the man who had somehow become my everything, I knew that this quiet, steady love, was exactly where I was meant to be.